Agriculture Minister Thoko Didiza has met with food processors, food and grain industry leaders and farmer groups. This is to discuss food supply risks amid the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. For more on this, we're joined now by agricultural economist Fiso Ndombela to share his views. Fiso, good evening and thank you very much for your time joining us tonight here on In Focus. It's broadly accepted that the impact on South Africa will mostly be felt through the price effect more than it will be felt really through supply issues. The minister coming out from the meeting with the industry yesterday saying that she's satisfied that, for example, we have had a good harvest and therefore we've met our requirement in terms of what needs to be exported, but also what we need at least in the interim here in the country. But of course, the price rises in the commodities have already begun to be felt globally. How significant is South Africa's exposure to these price increases?
Good evening, Thabo, and good evening to your viewers. You're certainly correct. I think because South Africa, maybe to start off, because South Africa is part of the global food systems where we are connected and with different countries in the world where we trade some of the commodities and we also send some of the commodities outside. And because South Africa is in terms of the global food system, is a relatively small player, so it tends to be affected and is not a price setter in the world market. So when global dynamics changes, that tends to precipitate into the local market where we see those prices increases. I think maybe it's important to just give a sense that before even the Russia-Ukraine has took place, we already seeing very high global prices, especially on the commodities such as your wheat, soybean, and to a large extent the sunflower. And that to a large extent were the functions of your global supply. Some of the main suppliers in the Americas and some of the constraint also in Europe and some of the Asian countries were impacting that. But South Africa, we sit in a space where in terms of the supply, I think we relatively secured because of that fall through. And we will start probably as we get into the season of the main commodities like your maize and the sunflower, where the prices will start also maybe to moderate from those high levels that we've been seeing in the past weeks.
Yeah. Now, half of the exports from out of South Africa are said to be agriculture, particularly fruits and nuts. And what is the likely impact then of this conflict on the performance of the agricultural sector around those commodities?
You are absolutely right, Thabo. We export a lot of our fruits, and I think it's also important to mention that some of our fruits, we can broadly separate them into those winter fruits, such as your citrus, which are coming in now as we head towards the winter months. And we just finished with the summer fruits like the table grapes and your stone fruit, which is just finishing up their season. Now, we still export to a variety of countries. Most of our fruits are going to your Northern Europe, which are your countries such as your Netherlands, your Germany, your France, and to the large extent as well your UK. We also send a lot of our fruits into Asia market as well as the Middle East. So now this exposure of South Africa, there will be some of those small quantities that we are sending, which we used to send in Russia, which I think the fruit players as well as government have already looked at what are the alternatives in terms of the supply and shifting those products that were initially intended either for Russia because of the economic sanction that might impact the export program into that Russia. So, but we do have other alternative markets on it. When you're looking in other commodities outside the fruits, if you're looking at the grains or you're looking at the livestock animals, we tend to export a lot of some of those commodities also into the Asian market and to the large extent into the African continent as we supply and ensure that they also food secured. So we believe that while there is to a certain extent an exposure and the impact that would come in because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but we relatively believe that South Africa will be able to find alternative market to send their product, and that will have a minimum impact, at least directly, in terms of the farmers not having to place their foot on the alternative markets.
Yeah. Now, in that particular context of finding alternative markets, is the food price effect a good or a bad thing that the commodity prices are a little bit higher at the moment?
I think it's always the challenge, of course, for the consumers. You want to see the prices as minimal as possible so that the more South African can be able to afford food. And taking into context, Thabo, that also South Africa, a large number of people are already suffering because of economic harsh conditions in the country where they're unable to afford food. So we believe that the more you put in measures in place and to minimize the price shock will be good for the consumers. But also what we must always take into account, we always have that lag effect between the commodity prices and actually what the consumer pay on the shelf side of it, because there is that lag in terms of the price transmission between the two. But I think after the meeting of government and industries, one of the key things that came up on that was to ensure that you release as quickly as possible credible information that will be able to keep the markets informed. Because when the markets are informed and they're informed with the accurate information, and that is not that is actually accurate and verified by the key industry players on the ground, it tends to help with the market and not to see these price shocks. But again, it also assists when the consumers play their part and not engage in panic buying, because that on its own tends to affect the market. And we do have history as well as good example in South African food system that even though there will be those disturbance in terms of the short term, but South African food system supply tends to correct itself quickly. We've seen that after the July unrest last year. We've seen it during the peak of the COVID, where they tend to move back into the equilibrium, and we're hoping that as we supply more information, that will be the case also in this time around.
Yeah. Let's discuss a little bit the Russia, Ukraine, South Africa linkages as far as the agricultural sector is concerned. How is South Africa linked to Russia as far as agri-trade is concerned?
Yes. So let's maybe zoom in. Let's start off maybe with your wheat, which is one of, you will know that we import a lot of wheat to satisfy our local demand. We import about 1.5 million that we're expecting to put in the country. And we used to import about over 600,000 tons of that from Russia in the past 2 years. What is very interesting, if you're looking at the latest SARS trade data, is that we've already reduced that from last year to about 100,000 tons of that. So you see that there was already that decreasing linkages between South Africa and Russia in terms of trade. That being the case, we still believe that Russia remains a key supplier of the wheat in the country, but not only just wheat, also barley. One of the key linkages that Russia, Ukraine in that region that supplies to South Africa is also the fertilizers, where we're importing about just over 2 million of fertilizers into the country, and bulk of that we're importing it from Russia. But that being the case, we also have a lot of other alternative markets that we can be able, should there come a situation where we are unable to import directly from Russia, that there are a lot of other suppliers that South Africa already have trade relationships that they have, which can be able to give us fertilizers. So in terms of the linkages directly, in terms of bilateral trade, it's mainly South Africa linkages with wheat and fertilizers, as I've put those numbers. But also, again, we were sending about 300,000 tons of fruits into the Russian market, mainly dominated by the citrus, and we believe that that could be one of the challenges that they might see as they are coming up into the scene. It's a good thing, as I said earlier on, that the table grapes as well as the other commodities have already closed their market, so they were able to put into the market for this season in its own.
All right, let's stay with that for a little bit, and then we'll come back to the question of what we are taking out. But let's stay with the fertilizer. Agri-SA saying the industry had already noted significant increases in fertilizer even ahead of the conflict with Ukraine, and somewhat the sector was already gearing itself up in some way, or at least looking for alternatives in terms of cheaper fertilizers. How true is that, and how significant is the fact that now the war or the conflict has come at this point?
Yes, I think the analysis of the industry players is correct. When we're looking at last year already, the price comparing with the with the 2020 prices of fertilizer. They were already above 100% in terms of increases in the fertilizers, which was mainly felt by the grain farmers in later last year when they were preparing with the planting. As we know that the fertilizers can contribute up to 40% of the production cost in a farmer. And those prices continue to increase in the first 2 months. We've seen in February as well as in January this year that they were already increasing above the already elevated period last year. And that is to a large extent was the function of those materials that are produced by different countries, which tend to be used in the mixture of fertilizers. But I think it's important to note then also the timing of the fertilizers that is mainly used in the country. That the good part for South Africa, we've already absorbed those in the last year when we were planting for the summer season, because we use large quantities of fertilizers in the second half of the year. So we're hoping in the next 2 months or 3 months, as the market adjusts into these global shocks that we have seen in the last weeks, they will be able to start mitigating and start to trace the long-term equilibrium of the prices. And by the time that South Africa start importing or needing a lot of fertilizers, as you know, we use large part of it in the second part of the year. We're hoping the prices will be much lower than they currently are at this stage.
Yeah. What does this mean then for the small-scale farmer, this increase in input costs? So you've got, firstly, what we have been seeing, energy increases. So the crude oil prices literally have tripled since February, between February and March, right? And you've got, as you mentioned, the global fertilizer prices having gone up, and then that playing out into the feed sector, and certainly having an impact on the commercial farmer, no doubt. But how severe is this? I mean, if you're saying 40% of the cost is just fertilizer for the farmer, that must really have a significant impact on the small-scale farmer.
Certainly, and I think you're right that, Thabo, it has a direct impact on all different type of farmers, but it hit differently on the small-scale farmers, because these are farmers that typically don't have the absorption of the shock absorbers for these price shocks, because they might not have the necessary resources that they need. They don't have the reserves that are there in their counterpart on the large and well-established farmers. So it tends to be really a big shock into them, because they also don't have the scale of keeping and producing in bulk to benefit from the economies of scale. So it tends to be much harder on the small-scale farmers. One thing which we've seen in those industry discussions between government and industries in the past couple of days was that also the consideration of rebuilding the capacity of South Africa in able to produce and mix some of these fertilizers domestically, because we do have some of the ingredients that we need to produce the fertilizers, and perhaps maybe rebuilding capacity of institutions such as your FOSCO, as well to the large extent the support around the SASOL, and working closer with the industry players that are participating within the fertilizer space are one of the measures that are being put in place to ensure that you increase your domestic production and be able to distribute it at a relatively lower than when you're directly importing it into the international markets. And over and above that, there are also some of the discussion within the state where we are able to expand in some of the support programs that are designed for the small-scale farmers. We know that last year the minister launched what they call the Presidential Employment Stimulus Initiative, and a part of that they have the comprehensive agricultural support programs, which are then dedicated and redesigned those tools into supporting the small-scale farmers with the inputs, and beyond the inputs, even some of the machinery that they require to be able to farm effectively. So we're hoping those programs will be able to become a cushion in ensuring that not all the small farmers can be hard hit and are able to be helped to retain in the production, because we want them to continue farming and ensure that they keep that land productive.
Yeah. You touched on something rather important. What is that element? Is it phosphate that is rather critical in the manufacturing of fertilizer, and how big is that industry in South Africa for us to be able to localize it?
Yes, in the discussion with the industries, it did come through that South Africa has really a big capability of producing that phosphate in the country and be able to link it with the mixtures. And so the country is able, if it can use it. Of course, there are other mixtures that might not necessarily be available in the country, but we have sufficient quantities to be able to use those raw material that are required in the country, or sorry, in the fertilizer industry, to be mixed. in that case. I think key over and above just the availability of the ingredient is then to be able, whether we still have the necessary skill and how quickly can we rebuild the skill and the system in place, because it's not only just about the availability of the raw material, but the material, when it's mixed, must be mixed to the level that it comply with the food standard of food safety and food quality, so that you ensure that what you put as a fertilizer, as you build them locally, they still give you the assurance that it will be safe and won't be any lacking in nutrients or elements that can be transferred to food, which might have later on have issues of safety into farmers. So all those things are being looked at a much more quicker pace, and we're hoping that they can be able either later in the year or maybe at least in the coming years, so that when you see these global prices increasing again in the future, South Africa is in a better position to be able to absorb them.
Important conversation on food security tonight. This as the industry observes what's happening between the Russia-Ukraine conflict and its impact on commodity prices. In conversation tonight with agricultural economist Sfiso Ntombela. Sfiso, before the break, we're touching a little bit more on the question of what we are, of course, bringing in. What happens when commodity prices are elevated to the question of food security? Are we likely to find ourselves in a position where we say, I mean, as the minister says, we will have a surplus, we will have enough, but we will still find people being food insecure, not because of a lack of food, but because the food is just unaffordable?
Yes, and I think that is one of the triple challenges that I think the country battles, which is the responsibility of all the economics sectors to try and make sure that we rebuild our economy. And I think it's part of the broader efforts, not only just for government, but also for businesses, as they implement the economic reconstruction and recovery plan. Because what that plan seeks to say is that how do you ensure that you bring more people into the employment so that they can be able to afford food? And in South Africa, we do have sufficient capabilities of producing sufficient food. We even, to the large extent, are the suppliers of food within the region, in the SACU and up to the SADC and the rest of the continent. I think the key question is that's always to say, how do you ensure you keep the food to be able to be afforded by a broader population? As we know, we're sitting at about 25% of population that is unable to afford food, and that is an affordability issue. And one of those areas, I think, if you're looking at it from the agricultural sector perspective, is really to try and ensure that we have more people producing their own food, but also participating in the formal agricultural value chain through the programs such as Your Land Reform, where it's really helping people to play more in that space. But I think also domesticating some of the food system in the regions where it's produced, so that it doesn't have to be transported from very far, because that on its own, with increasing fuel, it adds on the cost of food. So if it's produced and manufactured closer into different regions around the country, where it's closer to where people stay and procure and buy food, that will have in the near term a direct impact where the food start being affordable. And we're hoping those things, we can, of course, there are some of those commodities that you cannot easily just domesticate them or localize them, if I may use the word. But those that are there, such as your vegetables, to the large extent your grains, are being put on that. And I think this year as well, Thabo, it coincides, while the commodity prices are very elevated because of global dynamics, it's coinciding with the time where South Africa is expecting one of the biggest crop in terms of the harvest, whether you're looking at the maize, even in the wheat, we're expecting over 2.2 million tons that would be produced domestically. So we're hoping those news as that food start filtering into the market, it will start bringing the prices down, which will translate into minimized food prices for the consumer as he buys from the shop.
Yeah. How important is the strong rand effect, or maybe the weak rand effect, in this whole entire equation of the availability of inputs and so on, particularly when we look at crude oil, we look at fertilizers?
Yes, the exchange rate effect always assists, especially on those products that we rely on imports, because for imported product, we pay what we call import parity price, which tends to be much higher than the domestic price because you are basically a price taker from the international market. So the strengthening of rand tends to make us to be slightly competitive in bringing that food into the country. But that's where the challenge becomes in agriculture, because about 50% of the agricultural value added GDP is generated from export earnings. So we are very much an export-driven sector. So on the other side as well, while some of the farmers might be, or farmers or traders that are importing, such as your fertilizers and your wheat, to the large extent your soybean oil cake, which we use mainly on our animal feed, it assists in terms of strengthening of the rand. But the bulk of the farmers that are exporters, again, a stronger rand tends to be not what is ideal for them, because the foreign earnings tend to be much lower than when the rand is a bit weaker, because they make more money on that side, which is really those trade-off effects that tends to happen. Hence, you find a lot of farmers tends to move towards a mixed farming method, because it helps them then to spread out the risk and be able to benefit when the rand is stronger on the fertilizer side and when the rand is weaker on the export side of things.
Yeah. Speaking of the export side of things, I don't know if you have looked at this number. The agricultural export to the Ukraine, indicating that it has more than doubled between 2016 and 2020. How significant is that number? And will we be able to, I suppose, take that which we've been supplying to the Ukraine and add maybe a little bit more if we do find other markets, or the market that we have already been serving, maybe they can order more than what they were ordering?
Yes, and it's very important to really emphasize that point, Thabo, you are making, that Russia has been one of the fast increasing trading partners for South Africa, where we're sending a lot of export into that market. And also we were relying heavily also on some of the import from their side. I think what we have seen over the years with South African food players is that they have the agility and adaptability to adapt should they be facing different challenges in the food supply. We are able, I think, because of our ability to continue increasing our export footprint across a number of countries in the world. You might have noticed last year, Thabo, when we were celebrating the opening of Philippines, we also as the new export markets, we are making inroads in markets such as Japan and Thailand. And to the large extent, we're also having an existing trade agreement with the Americas, South America, through the Mercosur trade agreement, as well as the AGOA in the USA and also the EU. So that becomes a very good instrument in times like this, when South Africa has to say, this has been a market that has been growing for us, which is Russia. What can we quickly do to look at other alternative markets so that we are able to place those food that cannot maybe perhaps in the near term goes to Russia? And I think also the opening of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which have reduced tariffs into the African market, provide other alternative destination for South Africa, where we can be able to put those products, particularly those that are not perishable, because when you're looking at the African market, it tends to be a market that is difficult to supply due to logistical issues. So I think what I'm really trying to say to you, Thabo, and the viewers, is that those trade instruments that we have already existing in the different markets across the world are able to assist us to be able to negotiate much quicker the different places where we can send our product that we can not send into the Russian market. But we're also increasing the measures in place, where we're putting measures such as the credit insurance that can be able to support the exporters as they explore different market destinations and ensure that the product that is going to those markets is ensured to minimize the risk that can affect the farmers as well as the exporters.
Agricultural economist Susan Dobela, thank you so much for coming on tonight. I appreciate your time, sir, and joining us here on In Focus, helping us in that conversation. When we continue